tournaments feature on PS5. Innovation for us at PlayStation also means that we're going to lead the way with exploring new technology that unlocks new entertainment experiences. Virtual reality is central to that philosophy. Nothing elicits emotion quite like the VR medium. With next-generation VR for PS5, it's our vision to provide the ultimate entertainment experiences to players. Today, I'm thrilled to announce the official names for our next-gen VR system, PlayStation VR 2. And our next-gen controllers will be called PlayStation VR 2 Sense controllers.
Thursday, February 22nd, 2024, marks the one-year anniversary of the launch of the PSVR 2. Today, we look back from the very beginning, from its development, lead up to launch, the launch window, and what the first year has been like for Sony's second-generation VR device. PlayStation Virtual Reality 2, or PSVR 2, began development nearly 7 years ago, back in 2017. The device, from the beginning, was designed in tandem with the PlayStation 5 to take advantage of the increased computational power of Sony's new console. This parallel design strategy is what led to the PlayStation 5 having its USB-C port on the front of the console in the first place. The wired connectivity of the device, in contrast to the Meta Quest 2, was something Sony had considered during development but ultimately decided against as to not compromise the ability of the headset to push higher resolution images to its displays with minimal latency. While Sony announced the device and its flagship first-party title in Horizon Call of the Mountain at CES 2022, beyond features like foveated rendering, 4K resolution, and other basic functionality, no formal specs, additional software, or photos of the device were shown. An analyst from the Display Supply Chain Consultants, or DSCC group, however, did leak the exact display type and resolution of the headset 4 months later in April 2022. DSCC's reporting suggested Sony would be using a 6.4 to 7.1 inch AMOLED panel with over 800 ppi, or pixels per inch. This stood in contrast to the 193 ppi on the smaller 5.7 inch OLED panel used in the original PSVR headset. Sony was intent on making its next VR outing truly transformative in both performance and rendering techniques. PSVR 2 would feature 4K resolution support, 2000 by 2040 pixels per eye, and 110 degree FOV, which was a significant increase to the 960 by 1080 resolution and 100 degree FOV of the original PSVR. Refresh rates remained the same across both devices, with 90 to 120 Hz support for PSVR 2, but with the increased processing power of the headset and PS5, hitting high refresh rates would be more common and more consistent on PSVR 2. The tracking capabilities were also much improved over PSVR 1. The device sported 4 outward-facing cameras for improved position tracking, as well as 2 inward-facing cameras for eye tracking. These eye-tracking cameras allowed the device to perform a new rendering technique not seen in any previous consumer VR headset called foveated rendering. Foveated rendering, or foveated imaging, as it's also known, was originally demoed back at CES 2016 from a company called Sensomotoric Instruments, or SMI. This rendering technique allows cameras to track the movements of the user's eyes and render objects not being directly observed at lower resolutions, thus allowing for higher frame rates, which are crucial to smooth VR experiences. For context, the original PSVR headset required the PlayStation camera to perform position tracking via 9 LEDs. PSVR 2 also weighs in at just 560 grams, 6.6% lighter than the original PSVR. Perhaps its greatest feature was the new PSVR 2 controllers. Unlike the original PSVR, which required the use of the PlayStation Move controllers, which mind you were not designed to be used in VR, PSVR 2 controllers featured individual finger tracking much like Valve's critically acclaimed Knuckles, released back in 2019, and the same haptic feedback and adaptive triggers as featured in the PS5's DualSense controller. And while it still required a wired connection via the USB-C port on the front of the PS5, gone was the breakout box from the original PSVR. PSVR 2 required just one cable connection to the console in order to function. In an episode of the official PlayStation podcast in September of 2022, though, the cracks would start to show for PSVR 2. In this podcast, it was revealed that PSVR 2 would not be backwards compatible with PSVR 1 titles, similar to how PlayStation 5 is with PS4 titles. Developers would need to make bespoke versions of these titles or patch them forward. PSVR 2 would be made available in just 2 SKUs, one with just the headset and controllers at $549, or $599.99 for the aforementioned controller and headset with Horizon Call of the Mountain. Both bundles would launch on February 22, 2023, and were only initially available via the PlayStation Direct website. These would later be made available via retail storefronts. By most accounts, Sony released a great value in comparing the price to performance of other PC VR headsets. Most comparisons were being made to the MetaQuest Pro, which retailed for $1,499.99 just 4 months prior in October of 2022. The MetaQuest Pro, however, featured a lower resolution, heavier headset, and featured an LCD screen versus the AMOLED panel in the PSVR 2. Prior to launch, in a PlayStation blog post, Sony would detail nearly every potential consumer concern or question, including the 30 games available within the launch window and the over 100 games in development for the device. The 30 launch window games included new experiences like Horizon Call of the Mountain, Resident Evil Village VR, Demio, Gran Turismo VR, PSVR 1 ports like No Man's Sky, Moss Book 1 and 2, Puzzling Places, along with even new PC-only VR experiences migrating for the first time to PlayStation, like acclaimed PC VR FPS Pavlov. Just 3 weeks ahead of launch, on January 30th, 2023, business publication Bloomberg reported that Sony had reduced sales projections of its PSVR 2 headset significantly after pre-orders for the device had been less than enthusiastic. Reporting indicated sales forecast decreased by half from 2 million units to just 1 million. Sources at the AMOLED supplier for Sony's PSVR 2 headset described conversations where Sony had told them future display panel orders would be reduced, indicating they expected fewer future sales of the device, despite initial projections. Industry analysts from the International Data Corporation, or IDC, showed shipments of VR devices fell in 2022, but were forecasting growth of nearly 33% in 2023. Sony responded to claims it reduced their forecast the next day with outright denial, and doubled down on its perception of market enthusiasm for their headset. On February 22, 2023, the PSVR 2 officially launched with reviews for the device being generally favorable, noting its impressive visuals, controllers, and standout titles like Gran Turismo 7 VR, Horizon Call of the Mountain, and Resident Evil Village VR, which helped to showcase the device's improved rendering and tracking capabilities. Reviewers' main concerns were potential software droughts post-launch and the sticker shock for jumping into PlayStation's new VR offering, as potential customers wouldn't just need to pay the $550 for the headset, but rather an additional $400 for a digital PS5 at minimum should they decide to jump in, having never been exposed to the ecosystem. Setting up the device was fairly straightforward, as upon connecting the headset, the user's PS5 console would detect the headset and begin its initial setup. On-screen prompts would guide you through updating the headset and controller firmware, defining your play area, and determining the play style, be it sitting down stationary or in an open room. Despite concerns of cost, software lineups, and rumors of low sales, Sony confirmed on May 24, 2023, that PlayStation VR 2 had actually outsold PSVR 1 in its initial first 6 weeks on the market. For some, this was proof of success, that Sony had successfully launched its new VR device and had a strong sales footprint to build off of, with developers and customers alike. However, some feared that with all of Sony's first-party offerings having been released in Gran Turismo 7 and Horizon Call of the Mountain, Sony had little in the way of announced first-party output coming to the device. The clarity of PSVR 2's success would confound many in the industry, with Sony refraining from discussing specific numbers going forward. Historically, a bad sign with regards to hardware performance. PSVR 2, however, did continue to have a presence at Sony's consumer showcases. At the May 2023 showcase, Sony announced titles like Beat Saber, Resident Evil VR, Arizona Sunshine 2, Crossfire Sierra Squad, Synapse, and Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted 2. The summer was long for PSVR 2. Sony still had not been talking about hardware numbers, and with no first-party titles in sight, the paltry third-party offering led to fear PSVR 2 was failing in many of the same ways previous devices from Sony had. PSVR 2 had been so transformative in the way VR games were being played compared to PSVR 1 that for many studios, the development lift to port PSVR 1 games or introduce VR modes into existing PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 games was simply too big of an ask in both time and resources to justify. Long-awaited third-party FPS Firewall Ultra would eventually make its way to PSVR 2 on August 24, 2023. However, the game did not review well, and currently sits at an average of 61 on Metacritic. This had been one of the most anticipated titles leading into the last half of 2023, and one of the flagship third-party PSVR 2 titles coming to the platform, and its middling scores were a blow for the PlayStation VR community. Still, despite the continued silence on sales following statements made in May, PSVR 2 would once again be present at the September 2023 State of Play, with another showing of Resident Evil 4 VR set for release this winter, Among Us VR, and Ghostbusters Rise of the Ghost Lord out in October 2023. It was clear, despite continued announcements, that something was awry in the state of Sony VR. First Contact Entertainment, former Starbreeze developers, and the studio behind the aforementioned Firewall Ultra, announced in December 2023 that it would be closing its doors after 8 years working in the AAA VR space and canceling all ongoing development. The studio cited a, quote, lack of support for VR within the industry that has eventually taken its toll. The holiday 2023 sales season was none too kind to PlayStation VR 2 either, as Amazon's sales volume indicates PSVR 2 had been outsold by the MetaQuest 2 and MetaQuest 3 at a staggering 30-1. At the time of this video, PSVR 2 has just 2 first-party VR experiences and just 11 exclusive experiences to the platform. But even those numbers don't tell the whole story. Ongoing community-led projects like Flat2 VR have allowed PC players to forcibly render non-VR titles into fully-fledged VR games, which has made marquee exclusive experiences like Resident Evil 4 VR completely playable on PC. PSVR 2 at the start of 2024 continued to have a bleak outlook, but one more born out of rejection for the current content offering and not the device or platform itself. Sony's State of Play in January 2024 still included 2 PSVR 2 titles in Legendary Tales and Metro Awakening VR, the latter receiving a lot of excitement online, with many claiming it may be their reason to jump back into PSVR. So where does PSVR 2 go from here? Ongoing efforts to get the device working on PC in its full capacity continue from developers like iVRY, who has been working on the project for nearly a year now. No doubt this breakthrough would breathe new life into the device, but maybe not in the way that Sony would want. While hardware sales would certainly improve, Sony would likely see not nearly as much of the walled garden software sales it would expect normally from the sale of the headset. Rather, for PC owners looking for a high-performing VR headset at a lower cost. It seems unlikely Sony will take first-party developers off of their current projects in both live service and single-player games to bolster the PSVR 2's content drought. Sony could announce more third-party content partnerships with games previously only made available on other ecosystems like the MetaQuest, but without knowing the details of some of the exclusivity contracts likely in place for games like Asgard's Wrath 2, it leaves little hope in the way for ports coming to PSVR 2. A year later, it feels as though Sony has indeed repeated the mistakes it made in the past with PSVR 2, creating a technically impressive platform like the PS3 and the Vita before it, but one that requires much more effort from developers to take full advantage of, and only adds to the already complicated process of making games. PSVR 2 does seem to have underperformed against Sony's expectations for the device, and certainly against other PC VR consumer headsets like the Quest 2 and Quest 3 from Meta. The device is quite impressive technically, but without the software to fill out the catalog, there's been few reasons to power on the device for many, and coupled with the high cost of entry, new PSVR customers just aren't showing up in the way that Sony has hoped. The future of the device is ultimately in Sony's hands. New first-party or third-party offerings are going to need to come to the device to reinvigorate its customer base to engage and new customers to jump on board. Sony's recent financials show smaller margins from its gaming business despite higher revenue, and with a smaller platform like PSVR 2 that no doubt costs Sony more to manufacture than it sells for, little in the way of customer enthusiasm to engage, and likely dwindling software sales, I'm not so sure that greatness awaits.